So welcome. We're now beginning the panel on economics and energy. And we have a very distinguished panel. In just a moment, let me check and see if they have negotiated a different order of presentation. As it appears? Okay, excellent. All right, then, let's begin with Matthew Sagers.
Thank you. Now, although the topic is energy, in actuality, I'm just really going to focus on oil and gas. In many ways, as was mentioned by the ambassador, Central Asia is a large producer of uranium. Kazakhstan has become the world's largest producer. Uzbekistan is fairly significant as well, but it just really doesn't ring the bell much in terms of sort of the economy or international concern and all that sort of stuff. So it really comes down to oil and gas. And when you look at these economies, they are very, very dependent upon oil and gas. And I'm going to just talk about two general ideas here. One is what's happening after the oil price decline. It makes investment, particularly new projects, a lot more difficult. Central Asia is a relatively high-cost producer. Also, there's a lot of competition around nowadays that didn't even exist a decade ago, particularly in North America now. You can basically fall off a log, come back to North Dakota and produce oil nowadays at a fairly good return, a fairly benign environment. You don't have to chase off to Guinea-Bissau and Kazakhstan and Tajikistan and all these other places that nobody even can remember their name too much out of the CEO's boardroom. So basically, things are going to be a whole lot more difficult, although we do have some hope here to offer. The price drop has hit the government revenues and the overall economy is quite hard. I'm going to leave that for my colleagues to cover. Basically, Kazakhstan has decided to draw upon its rainy day, the national fund, to sustain economic growth during the current downturn. What is the impact upon Caspian oil and gas projects? Basically, I'm looking at regional oil production remain fairly flat, pending the startup of a couple of big projects that have been going on for some time here. We're expecting to see Kashagan Phase 1 start up in 2017. We'll see the launch of the Future Growth Project at Tengiz in 2021 now instead of 2018. And basically, I'm expecting Kazakhstan to be the key source of Eurasian oil growth going forward. Gas exports, on the other hand, we're basically expecting more of the same. We're expecting gas exports to continue to rise. Basically, it's China that is the big buyer. We're also going to see the launch of SD2, Shah Deniz 2 on the Azerbaijani side, and the development of the southern corridor into Europe. I realize that we're talking about Central Asia here, but at the risk of being a faux pas here, I still call them the Stans and the Zhan. Shoot me if you want to, but basically I see them very, very closely linked. We call them, Caspian, Central Asia, and whatnot, but very much the same here. Let's look at what's been happening to the oil price collapse. We had this very, very rapid decline in oil prices in 2014. And it was because global oil markets were in huge oversupply. The key factors were the U.S. The unconventional oil production in the U.S. has just simply expanded very rapidly and put a lot of excess supply in the market. OPEC then elected not to cut production to try and balance it. So therefore, the balancing act is going to have to be done on the production side by a variety of other players, mainly the U.S. Going to have to be done through markets rather than through administrative fiat. It's going to be a very different story here. And at the same time, we're beyond the big, long cycle that came with all the commodity prices and so forth, driven mainly by China. China has now shifted to a much lower growth trajectory. That's affected oil demand and a lot of other commodities as well. We saw that oil prices dropped by about 60% during this period of time. The key regional oil blends basically track this down. The other thing that I wanted to just draw your attention to is about 4 months ago, we basically said that the oil price is going to bottom out in about the first quarter, hit bottom right around 45 bucks. That seems to have been sort of what's happened here. We've sort of hit the bottom and begin to turn around here. Because the economies of Russia and the other Caspian states, particularly Central Asia, are very, very close linked to the oil price, I said, it's hit very, very hard. GDP growth has basically dropped below 2% for everybody across the region in Q4. Russia GDP growth has gone into the negative range, -5%. And then going forward, we're looking at much lower economic growth for the other countries. I'll let my other colleagues basically talk about that in terms of the near term. Currencies have also weakened, partly in response to the difficult economic conditions, whether it's what's happening in terms of the ruble in Russia or the oil price overall here. Longer term, we are expecting global oil prices to rebound. We thought that we're going to hit a bottom this time. We're going to have a fairly difficult transition that's going to last between now and about 2020. But over the medium term, we're expecting prices to basically come back up to the range of $90 to $95 a barrel real. This has very important implications for Central Asia and for Kazakhstan. If oil prices were still down around 50, last person out, turn off the lights, because there's not going to be much going on here. But on the other hand, given the fact that we see a rebound happening, and it's basically the fact that in the oil market, we're looking at demand that's going to be around 100 million barrels a day in 2030 or so. That means that there's going to be a number of marginal producers that have to be in the market. Prices driven by that marginal producer. That marginal producer that's got to be in the market is around 90 to 95 bucks a barrel. Now, what could change? Well, we could end up with lower cost producers that have a much bigger supply horizon than we think. Or demand could be a lot lower. Either one of those could basically affect this. But like I said, anyway, it ends up being quite important for our producers in the region. And basically the unconventional revolution is just this sea change, this technological innovation that's basically changed everything in the world. What's happened now is that the U.S. has been growing more rapidly than any other country in the world. Half of our gas now comes from unconventional and so forth. What does this mean for Central Asia and the Caspian region? Non-OPEC production means weaker global oil prices. A couple years ago, for Kazakhstan, we were doing a story, basically a series of workshops. What is the single biggest threat to us? And they had a whole list of things that they thought. And I said, no, it's called unconventional oil production in North America. And they looked at me and they go, yeah, what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot of it. Oil price is going to go down. It's going to be weaker than it ever was before. And the other thing that's going to happen is, in the past, oil companies basically had to chase reserves. Everybody was looking all around the world. There was this mentality that reserves were short. Therefore, whoever had it, I beat a pat to their door. I begged the president of the country to sign the deal. No matter what it was, they turned me over their lap. They spanked me on my bottom. I didn't care. I wanted those reserves. Different story now. Oil can be found in North Dakota. Oil can be found in Pennsylvania. A lot of different places now. And therefore, the oil companies don't have to do that anymore. That means that with those upstream opportunities in North America, a lot of the terms and conditions that we find in the region are just simply uncompetitive for attracting international investment. And I think that this is one of the key things that's got to come out of this. The host countries' mentalities and approaches to the companies, they still think it's the glory days of the 2000s. And that's just not what it is now. Companies are competing much more strenuously around the world for a smaller investment pool. And the countries are just simply not going to find, the big companies are just not going to be willing to spend the kind of money that they did before. And countries that are going to be successful are ones that recognize this, and they move ahead to change the terms, and they basically look at three key things that they've got to do to be competitive. Change the fiscal terms, drop some of the local content requirements, and also greatly speed up and improve the quality of their decision making. If you're able to do that, you're going to be able to attract investment and basically move on here. Let's look at what's been happening on the oil side here. We basically said that Caspian oil production has been relatively flat. For a long time, it was rising quite rapidly. Then, very, very recently, the past 3 years or so, it's been fairly flat. You can basically see this curve here. You can see rising upwards, basically driven upwards by Azerbaijan and also Kazakhstan as well. But what is happening now is that Azerbaijan's production is in long-term decline. Kazakhstan is in stasis. Turkmenistan is going up, but hey, doesn't matter a whole lot. And basically, we're expecting that it's going to resume its upward trajectory because basically I'm expecting a couple of big projects in Kazakhstan that have been going on for some time, these will basically be able to go ahead. And we'll talk about a couple of these a little bit later on. These are big, big ticket items. $50 billion in Kashagan Phase 1. Still not producing a barrel of oil. It will in 2017. Next phase of expansion for Tengiz, about $30 billion. We don't have a final investment decision yet, but it's going to happen this year. And phase 3 expansion of Karachaganak, the other big one in Kazakhstan, remains under consideration. You would think that with $50 a barrel oil, that it would be out of the money. The answer is, with $50 a barrel, a lot of the EPC companies are really hurting. Costs have basically come down quite dramatically in the past couple of years. And therefore, even though this is, again, about a $30 billion project, it remains in the hunt, so to speak. Not sanctioned, still talking about it, but the point is, it's not out of the money. We talked about kind of what's happening in terms of overall production here. Flat overall. Kazakhstan flat, it's been the key driver. Azerbaijan is now basically post-peak. Turkmenistan's output has been rising. And the key thing that I wanted to point out here was that the state company production has been going down. It's been the international companies that have been ticking upwards. And that's been the trend that we've seen for the past few years here. At Tengiz, which is the bellwether project that's determined Kazakhstan, it really has to do with the fact that they spent about $6 billion a number of years back, basically doubled the amount of capacity, and then since then production has been fairly stable, and what it's done from year to year is dependent upon what's been happening in terms of maintenance. But as I indicated here, TCO is now gearing up for its next generation expansion project on the order of $30 billion to add about 12 million tons of capacity here. We expect those things to happen, and in terms of my future outlook here, I'm expecting Kazakhstan to be the key source of oil growth going forward. And since we also have a view that prices are going to recover, this probably has some important implications for where Kazakhstan is going to be going in terms of its overall economy here. But we are looking at a much flatter production profile than earlier because a lot of those projects have all been pushed back, delayed, and will come on a little bit slower than before. Kashagan delay, this has been so covered in the news here, but basically they spent $50 billion, started the project in the fall of 2013, found all kinds of leaks in the pipelines. They basically had to go back and replace it at their expense. They basically chosen a fix that's $3.6 billion in an effort to try and get this thing up and running in kind of a reasonable time period. But it's still taken very, very, very long. Now, the big question for Kashagan is, given the fact that they spent $50 billion and a break-even price of somewhere around $90, is this project ever going to go anywhere? That's kind of the question that everybody's been asking. And according to our analysis, yes, we're expecting prices to be back in this particular range. But on the other hand, phase 2 has not been sanctioned. And we basically see this happening as well. And the reason is it's very important for Kazakhstan. In the past, Kazakhstan basically thought, oh, the oil companies, we can basically sort of stick it to them. We can be very, very tough and so forth. Now, the shoe is on the other foot. I wouldn't be surprised to see a compromise that includes some things like extension of the PSA, maybe some rollback in terms of the royalties and so forth, to try and get that project basically going in terms of where it is. Because in many ways, that is Kazakhstan's future. The other big story here that I didn't really have a slide to basically talk to you about was that basically the Chinese here have been very, very important. They now account for about 1/4 of Kazakhstan's production. They've invested something on the order of $10 billion, just a little bit shy of a $10 billion over the past couple of decades. And quite important overall. But again, for Kazakhstan, what they want is they want to also have multi-vectoral national policy. besides having the oil going in a variety of directions, including China, they also want a variety of investors as well. If they stay pat in terms of the terms that they've got, there's only going to be one source of investment, one investor that they're going to have. And that's just simply not acceptable to Kazakhstan. All the more reason why I think that we're going to have a compromise on this going forward. However, the other thing that I wanted to point out was that a lot of the stuff that the Chinese bought, with the exception of the most recent purchase into Kashagan, these are all been fairly mature assets. And the assets have been, they've reached their maximum, they're on their way down. And so the result is this is why Chinese oil production, equity production in Kazakhstan has been dropping a little bit because of these mature assets. Even as they've added more, it's not been enough to offset the decline in some of the older stuff that they bought here. The other big story on oil is that for the first time last year, Kazakhstan was a major transit country for Russian oil. Russia's always been a major transit country for Kazakhstan. Last year, because basically there was a refinery in Sichuan Basin down here at Pengzhou, owned by CNPC, needed oil. Rosneft is on the hook to deliver a bunch of oil to China for some past contracts and whatnot. CNPC says, we want the oil here, and the only way it can get here is to come through Kazakhstan. Make it so. A deal was struck, went on. And so, again, this is part of this relationship that you guys were hearing about earlier, a little bit later on. It's not just a one-way relationship. Yes, Kazakhstan is dependent upon Russia for certain kinds of things. But we've also seen where Russia has become dependent upon Kazakhstan for certain kinds of things as well. Let's talk about gas for a second here. Regional gas production continues to rise. Turkmenistan was the big story in 2014. We're expecting growth to continue with two big projects, Galkanish, the mega super gigantic major field in Turkmenistan, and also Shah Deniz 2 over in Azerbaijan. China has intensified its energy relationships with Central Asia, emerging as the key growth market for the region's gas. Last year, our Caspian Watch had the title Vini Vidi Vici, about what China had done in Central Asia, and that story really hasn't changed a whole lot, but that's part of the multi-vectoral policy that's been emerging over time here. This is what happened to regional gas production. We hit a new all-time post-Soviet high. Turkmenistan's production is now back up to about where it was, roughly, at the time of the end of the Soviet period of time. Uzbekistan's gas production is still declining and will continue to do so. Kazakhstan's gas production is basically associated gas, so it's basically along with that. And Azerbaijan ramping up, as we talked about, in preparation for the launch of the big southern quarter here. The big story is that this is a big mega project, $45 billion in terms of investment, basically proceeding. Just a week ago, we had the opening ceremony for the TANAP project. It's the section of the pipe that goes through Turkey. Basically was held in Kars last week. So this project is basically going along here. Big projects. And like I said, I still consider it to be part of Asia, Central Asia, because it's still basically in that same region, but it's basically on the other side of the Caspian, so it's quite a bit different here. In Turkmenistan, the revival has begun here. The big field has been ramping up. The big story is that Kazakhstan has been looking to expand and diversify its gas exports. China has been the big growth area. It really has not been too successful looking at other alternatives, whether we're going south via Tapi, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, or going west into Azerbaijan. Overall, that space is kind of taken here. But on the other hand, the key story here is that China's expansion is basically revved up into very, very high gear. They've done all kinds of stuff in terms of the big agreement, basically providing money, long-term purchase agreement, building all these export pipelines, providing service contracts and equipment supplies, equity participation in Turkmen upstream, the only company to have this in the eastern area. And I think that that's going to be where we're at here in terms of the future. China is going to be the big dog on the block. Basically, we're going to see continuing ramp up as China buys. But basically what you're doing is you're substituting one hegemon, used to be Russia, for China as the hegemon. And so the result is the risks to the overall economy basically increasing over time. It was a very, very quick overview, but I promised that I wouldn't take up too much time. So let me turn it over.
Thank you. That was excellent. For those of you who don't already know Matthew, I should mention that he is with IHS CIRA. He heads the Russian and Caspian Energy Advisory Service, and that was a great example of just how much of the world you have to incorporate to really understand what's unfolding in the oil and gas sectors for our region. Next up will be Dr. Sergei Gretsky. He is a lecturer at the Catholic University and a member of the Central Asia program at George Washington University. And he has long been a friend both of the State Department and of Georgetown University.
Thank you, Theresa. We've already heard about problems that Kazakhstan has been experiencing since the American and European sanctions hit Russia. We heard about Eric's call to withdraw money from Kazakhstani banks if anyone have accounts there. Kazakhstan currently spends about $2 to $3 billion a month to prop up its currency. Russian ruble devalued 47% against tenge, which creates lots of problems for the Kazakhstani economy, which are kind of repetitive to what happened at the start of the 2008-2009 world financial and economic crisis. The enormous amount of money Kazakhstan spends on propping up the currency is clearly one of the reasons to moving up presidential elections to the end of April. Despite their current reserves are at $100 billion, they can't continue to prop it up much longer. Kazakhstan export to the countries of Eurasian Economic Union has dropped by 41% to Russia, 46% to Belarus, 500 times less to Armenia, 500% to Armenia, while imports from those countries rose. Kazakhstan imports 7.3% more goods from Russia, 20% more goods from Belarus, and 33% more goods from Armenia. Russian banks have used Kazakhstan to essentially for capital flight out of Russia. It's not going only through onto Europe or offshore accounts on the European route. Russian central bank had to issue directives to stop that capital flight by essentially invoicing for goods non-delivered. Kazakhstan banking sector has benefited from that capital flight, but at the same time it has not recovered yet from the 2008 financial crisis and other issues related to the more of political nature related to the Kazakhstani nationalization of Kazakhstani banking sector. Today it continues to be the highest banking sector in the world in terms of non-performing loans. Is it all that bad? Where's the clicker? How does it work? Kazakhstani GDP, it's a little bit outdated figure, shows that the country still dominates not only Central Asia, but is in a better position than Central and East European countries, emerging markets, not to mention less developed countries. Kazakhstan, and Ambassador Hoagland spoke about that, has introduced earlier in the day economic reforms that allowed it to significantly lower the poverty rate compared to China, India, Russia, not just Central Asian states. Kazakhstan has done reasonably well in terms of introducing legislation and actually implementing the laws that make it one of the 50 most favorable places of doing business. Registration of property, particularly protecting investors. I'll make a footnote here that place refers mostly to foreign investors. I'll explain a little bit later. Kazakhstan is one of the 50, it fluctuates from year to year, most competitive countries in the world. And I will point, I don't know whether it has a, no. I will point to one indicator, macroeconomic stability of Kazakhstan. It slid a little bit from 16th place to 23rd in the world, which makes Kazakhstan macroeconomically a more stable country and economy than most countries of the European Union. And that's what has been attracting businesses from the Eurasian Economic Union and other countries to come to Kazakhstan. Even before the sanctions kicked in 2013, the number of foreign companies that have been registered and are operating in Kazakhstan has increased by 90%. Most of them are from Russia. And they are not just China. Turkey is the second country in terms of those businesses registered. China is the third. And less than half of those countries deal with trade. Mostly they cover with processing, transport, service industries, IT, and other sectors of the economy that are helping to diversify Kazakhstani economy. And this is the key issue, not just for Kazakhstan, but for Eurasian Economic Union in general. Since independence, as you can see, the share of natural resources in Kazakhstani exports has been growing from 25% in 95 to 88.3% today. The share of natural resource rents in GDP has increased from 11% in 2001 to 38% currently, while the same figure for Russia as a reference point is 22%. Kazakhstan imports 92% of consumer goods. In 1991, it exported 120 million tons of meat. Now it imports meat from Ukraine, though And this is to reference again to an expectation by many in Central Asia in general that the current Russian sanctions against foodstuffs from EU would open a window of opportunity to export meat, fruit and vegetables to Russia, which is clearly not happening anytime soon. The issue with diversification of the economy, I think my slides are incorrect, what I apologize for. For that deal, have to deal with this. Property rights protection measures the likelihood of the expropriation of a business. And the red line is Kazakhstan, the black line is the world average. And as we can see, despite all the progress in that Kazakhstan has made since independence, protection of property rights remains alarmingly low. And so does the Investment Freedom Index. This is from Heritage Foundation database, which measures the likelihood of the expropriation of investment that economic actors make in Kazakhstan. Again, at about 30%, 70% chance that your business, if you invest and your investment would be expropriated. However, I mentioned that Kazakhstan is in the 22nd place in the world in terms of investment protection, and that relates mostly to foreign investment. It has been observing, by and large, the agreements it has signed with foreign investors. It recently introduced an important change to its law on subsoil reserves, which would allow foreign investors, basically copying from the Australian law, which would allow foreign investors to come and invest in Kazakhstan fairly freely and easily. Yet Kazakhstan, as also a positive sign, does not depend on Russia, Belarus, or other Armenia or soon-to-be Kyrgyzstan in terms of its trade. And that has been the general trend for Central Asia. In terms of exports, European Union is the #1 partner for Central Asia in general. In terms of imports, China is the main partner, and in terms of total trade, China dominates as the preeminent trade partner of Central Asia. And you can see the dynamic, which shows you that in 10 years, the direction of trade has changed 180 degrees for all Central Asian states, while inter-regional trade has, as a matter of fact, decreased. For Kazakhstan specifically, the #1 trade partner is European Union. So is the case for China, and so is the case for Russia. What does it mean? We heard about the New Silk Road initiative that the State Department has been promoting for a number of years, to hoping that northern distribution network would transform itself into a new Silk Road, going from from north to south. But this is the reality. And the reality is called the Eurasian Land Bridge and New Eurasian Land Bridge. And these are the, Ambassador Hoogland mentioned sort of that reality in his presentation. The current route that Chinese experts take to Europe is maritime. It's in the red, and sort of I like that slide because in a way it gives you sort of an idea that because of that route, Chinese economy is in the red. While this new rail link, two of them, as a matter of fact, not just Trans-Siberian Railway, which is in blue, but the new railway from two key Chinese IT and industrial production cities of Chengdu and Chongqing, go through Kazakhstan, Russia, Belarus, to Poland, where it is these goods are distributed further on to Europe. This is the Deutsche Bahn, which is a partner in that project. Shows you these two railways in a sort of a clearer picture, which for China not only lowers, as you can imagine, the cost of shipping its goods and exports to Europe, but also provides, more importantly, lowers geopolitical and logistical threats to its risks to its exports. And since I'm out of time, and this tells you that at least one country, we heard a lot about the Eurasian Economic Union, but at least one country is vitally interested in the success of that Eurasian Economic Union. It is China, because again, the cost quoting of its exports to Europe is really amazing.
Thank you, Sergei. Our last presentation today will be Brent Hierman for this panel. He's an assistant professor in the Department of International Studies and Political Science at Virginia Military Institute. His research interests are interethnic relations and local political economy. So to give us hopefully a local and rural perspective, please.
Thank you very much. I will start off with the caveat that, like many of the previous presentations, this will not be overly optimistic. I apologize. I am going to focus largely on the rural political economics of Central Asia, specifically on land reform, agricultural reform initiatives that have been going on since independence in most, actually all of the states of Central Asia. And I'm going to make the case that understanding these dynamics, understanding the agricultural dynamics, understanding the reform dynamics in the rural areas is fundamental for understanding Central Asia. These are, by and large, rural countries. Huge percentages of the population live in the countryside. So understanding these dynamics gives us insight into rural welfare, into the economics, as well as into the quality of the state, because these are reform initiatives. These are initiatives emanating from the center that have to be carried out in local areas, and so to the degree that they're successful or actually occurring, provides us insight into how much power the state actually has, or the lack thereof. And so I'm going to focus today on the politics of these reforms. Right? The classic understanding of politics is who gets what, when, all the question words. So the politics, who's getting, who's winning, who's losing. With especially an eye to looking at to what degree ethnic tensions, ethnic relations have been exacerbated by these reforms. And there's a positive story there, because aside from Kyrgyzstan, I'm going to make the case that they haven't largely exacerbated ethnic relations. So that's my optimistic insight for the day. And then I'm going to also talk about what these reforms suggest, what the quality of these reforms suggest about how the countryside is stabilized. Let me make sure. Okay. So as an overview, I'm focusing on four of the Central Asian countries. Like many of the previous panelists, I can't speak about Turkmenistan. It's sort of a black box to me. And so I'm focusing on Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan here. All of these states have a significant agricultural, economic position. They all have a significant portion of the population work in agriculture. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan initiated land reform much earlier, more successful land reform earlier than in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. They initiated land reform beginning in the early 1990s, and from at least certain perspectives could be seen to be successful in these land reforms. In Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, there's private ownership of land, and so the decollectivization process, the breaking up of the kolkhozes and the sovkhozes, has occurred. And individuals have their own land shares that they own, and they can alienate, they can do what they want with that land. In Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, it's been a slower process. It began later. And there you still have state ownership, official state ownership of land. Individuals have land use rights. And in many cases, these are long-term land use rights, but the state continues to hold the actual ownership of the land, and so could conceivably and has taken that land away from individual farmers in those cases. And as you can see in the last column, I talk about ethnified tensions over land, and there's politics involved in land reform everywhere across the post-Soviet sphere and in Central Asia, but in my analysis, I found that in Kyrgyzstan is where you see the ethnified tensions, exacerbation of ethnic relations, whereas in the other states, you haven't to the same degree. And to kind of illustrate that, I have some exemplars of the type of tensions, the type of political demands or the political debates that have occurred around land in each of those four states. In Kazakhstan, in 2003, the Article 170 of the Land Code was heavily debated, publicly debated, and voices came from either side. They crossed ethnic lines. This article was establishing that starting in 2004, by 2004, farmers had to either personally cultivate their land, purchase their land, or give back their land. And this was an effort to eliminate subleasing. Many were very upset about this because, especially where you had large plots of land in the north, it was believed that this was going to steal land out of the the hands of the average farmer and allow wealthy individuals, rural wealth holders, just to accumulate large sectors of the land. And this was publicly debated. There were Russians and Kazakhs on either side of this debate. In Kyrgyzstan, you've had basically two waves of ethnic tensions over land. In the early 1990s, you had local dynamics involving land scarcity, perhaps most famously in the Osh events of 1990, which involved land scarcity, as well as in the national level, where laws were passed. Twice laws were passed through Parliament, or potential bills were passed through Parliament, establishing an explicit claim that the land of Kyrgyzstan belonged to Kyrgyz. The first time it was vetoed by Akayev. The second time it was a much watered down version of that bill, and it had language related to the fact that this agency was going to promote traditional Kyrgyz ways of farming, whatever that meant. And eventually that was pulled out. But in the 1990s, this was very much a public debate. And since then it largely was, I wouldn't say it didn't disappear, it was papered over for the next decade plus. And then in 2005, after the Tulip Revolution, you had the reemergence of localized tensions over land. You had incidents of squatters claiming lands of ethnic minorities, perhaps most famously Kadir Jambatirov's land in southern Kyrgyzstan was squatted on for a period of time. At the same time, you also had the nationalistic rhetoric emerging in Kyrgyzstan at the national level as well. In Tajikistan, similar to Kazakhstan, the debates have largely been about class. It's the fear of wealthy elites being able to claim land and depossess the average farmer. And in 2012, the example I'm going to talk about is the debate over selling land use rights. And this was again seen as a way, from critics of the law, or critics of the decree, that a way of taking land away from the average farmer. And since 2008, in Uzbekistan, there's been mergers of land, mergers of property going on, where land has been consolidated. And supposedly this is supposed to allow productive farmers to get more land, right? And the state can take land away from the average farmer because the average farmer doesn't own the land itself, right? And there's a lot of discussion on the ground of whether these are going to truly productive farmers or people who are just better connected. Now, that's just a general broad overview of some of the dynamics, some of the tensions that are occurring in the region. I'm going to zoom in Tajikistan because I think it's a good example of some of these dynamics, and also because I have better data, and that's always a useful way to go forward, I think. And this is from a recent survey I conducted in parts of rural Tajikistan. I'm not claiming this is representative of all of the rural population of Tajikistan. It is certainly, I believe, representative of the random villages I selected. And I asked questions about public goods, perceptions of public good provisions in Tajikistan. You should note that I conducted this survey in the late spring, early summer, which is perhaps why when asked about whether they're fully satisfied with the degree of electricity, that number seems ridiculously high. I bet if I asked in February, I'd hope it would be different. But sanitation is the highest scoring public good there, and this relates, I think this can be understood because when asked another battery of questions about goods production, many believed that they could produce sanitation locally. They could provide that goods locally, so they had control over it. I'd like you to note that land access and agricultural water are the two worst scoring public goods. Fewer individuals in these villages believed that their access to land, their ability to have land, was something that they were fully satisfied with. And just to show you the level of dissatisfaction, it's not quite the inverse of that data, but again, land access and agricultural water were the two goods that people were most dissatisfied with. And just to explore a little bit the ethnic component in Tajikistan, right? Tajikistan is an ethnically diverse state. There's a large Uzbek minority there. World Bank data, some analysis I've done of some World Bank data has indicated that Uzbeks were statistically significantly more likely to work in agricultural collectives than Tajiks. So maybe there's discrimination going on. However, I suspect what's happening there is that a larger proportion of Uzbeks work in cotton farms than do Tajiks, and so that finding, I think, is capturing the higher likelihood of cotton farms remaining collectivized. And so when asked about satisfaction with land access, there's no variation between Uzbeks and Tajiks. Whereas there is statistical significant variation about other goods, in particular the police and education. So at the very least, we can say there hasn't been an ethnic frame about land distribution. People are not talking about land distribution as an ethnically discriminatory practice to the same degree as they are in Kyrgyzstan, for instance. So why are people dissatisfied? Well, largely it's a perception of inequitable distribution. It's the perception that the wealthy will get better land than others. And it has to do with the nature of the reform in Tajikistan. The reform has emanated from the center. The policies, the decrees, the laws came from the center, and then were conducted, or it has been carried out at the local level by local elites, largely collective farm managers. This has given them a tremendous amount of power in determining whether the collective farms break up or not. And some analysis that I've done looking at variation in various districts. These are all cotton growing districts. These are 14 cotton growing districts, just to give you an example. If I take those districts that are far away from Dushanbe, right? There's an understanding that the Dushanbe, there's an effect being near to Dushanbe, right? So if you look at only those districts that are 100 kilometers or more away from Dushanbe, which is a significant number of cotton growing districts in Tajikistan, I found that productive districts, having productive farms, was a necessary condition of not decollectivizing or continuing to have collective farms. Now, this could be interpreted in a positive light, right? Maybe you see decollectivization where collective farms are not working, and so because it's more efficient to break up the farms, they're breaking up. However, unfortunately, given the findings I have on the ground when talking to collective farm managers who have broken up farms and collective farmers and private farmers, it turns out that in most cases, collective farm managers are deciding to break up their farms because they're not able to turn a profit. And this is largely because the quality of the land has been degraded or there's irrigation issues. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that private farmers are getting land shares of land that is often not particularly useful. And so a success story, a district that has often been seen as a success in Tajikistan is Zafarabad in the north, in Suld. It has the highest score there. It's almost 90% decollectivized when this data was collected. Well, much of that land, when I was talking to farmers there, it turns out not to be particularly useful. And many people have to work on several different farms to try to string together a living, or rely on remittances. So ultimately, this this leads me to my conclusions, which, again, the promised pessimism. Many private farms, especially in Tajikistan, but I believe this holds true for Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan as well. Kazakhstan is sort of a unique case in large part because of the natural gas and oil wealth. But many private farms remain reliant on remittances. And what does that mean for the future? Well, given the talk we've been having all day about migrant workers potentially coming home in large numbers, again, we don't know for sure what exactly is happening there. This could have a potentially very problematic impact in the rural areas because there's no indication that they have the ability to absorb that population returning home. And so ultimately, my take-home point is that last bullet point. Rural welfare in Central Asia, it remains precarious, and agricultural reforms have not done much to enhance rural welfare. So, sorry with the pessimism.
Well, if we compare across these three, one conclusion we get is that if we could only get the Chinese interested in agriculture in Central Asia, we might see a different outcome. But one thing that is very striking, besides the pervasive pessimism, is the extent to which things have shifted in a decade. We've gone from an era of very high oil prices and optimism of the power of the state to an era of low prices and the state having to reconsider. The principal partner has pretty clearly shifted in very many sectors, from Russia and even from the former Soviet partners over to China. And there is increasing divergence among the states in how they govern, what they do and don't reform, and how they move forward. I'd like to ask one question of each of our panelists and then throw it open to the rest of you. But beginning with Brent, where we finished, my question to you is, when you look at that percentage of the labor force in agriculture and you see that it remains so high in Tajikistan, in how many states is the unwillingness to privatize or to break it up more about social control than it is about agriculture?
Yes, and so at the district level, it is about social control, but it's about local control and local power, and the result of the reform, or the way the reform has unfolded, has empowered or emboldened local actors, not formally. Formally, they are tasked with formally following the law emanating from the center, and they're supposed to inform the farmers about their rights, and farmers are supposed to have their own choice about whether they pull out land or not. But in many cases, farm managers have skipped that middle step, and or have biased the decision-making process. So even when information has been given, they'll often stress, well, it's going to be really hard for you if you don't have access to good water or tractors or all these things, and the risks of private farming, which are great, are highlighted. And so in my analysis, I think a lot of it has to do with the local dynamics of control rather than the center. The center, I'm not sure, I can't get a good read on what the center is actually trying to achieve in many cases. And sometimes, this, because the nature of the reform has been initiated in large part through discussions with international agencies and international actors pressuring for this reform.
That's interesting. Well, if what the center wants in Tajikistan is unclear, perhaps it's a little bit clearer in the case of Kazakhstan. Sergei, can you talk a little bit about what is this dynamic with Kazakhstan having long had a relationship with the West that was shaped by oil sales? As China takes a larger and larger presence in the energy sector, what does that mean for state behavior, particularly in the oil and gas? Have you seen significant shifts in central government intent or how it's intervening in the sectors?
I will leave to Matt to talk about oil and gas sector, but in a way the same, it's not a tendency, it's sort of a process, full-blown process that Brent just spoke about is happening in Kazakhstan. What we're witnessing is, again, reimposition of state control over the economy by deprivatization of the economy. In 2012, there were 4,000 state-owned enterprises, and we're talking about big, medium to big enterprises. Now there are 6. The share of Samruk Kazina, that's the national welfare fund of Kazakhstan, thus in the Kazakhstani economy, is now at 65%. And this is something that is openly discussed and debated by a number of key officials in the country. But the trend to basically, which we have been observing since the 2008-2009 global financial and economic crisis, is to sort of a reinstatement of or instatement of state capitalism in the country, which is kind of what Russia has been doing. So in that sense, they're moving in the same direction. And it is very often it's driven by people who have been educated in the West. That's a sort of a, I guess, a footnote to Ambassador Hoogland's presentation on that people who were educated in the West would bring sort of a paradigm shift in running the states and the economies. As a matter of fact, the person who has been driving this deprivatization of the economy is a graduate of Georgetown's program. And we know who we're talking about. And Theresa, you remember your favorite slide about the transparency of National Welfare Fund, which is administered by the National Bank of Kazakhstan. You remember it was 8 out of 10, the best among any developing countries, emerging markets, better than Russia. It was 8 out of 10 in 2012. In 2014, it dropped to 2. From 8 to 2 with the arrival of Kairat Kelimbetov to the position of the governor of the National Bank of Kazakhstan. That's how things change fast. And in the wrong direction.
In terms of things changing fast, Matthew, you've made a good case that better efficiency in the fields is going to be essential to still be profitable, but at the same time, increasingly, the customer is China. So how does that presence of China as a customer have an impact on how the sectors continue to unfold? Will they go for more efficiency, or will they be irresistibly attracted by state-to-state deals?
Well, they're going to continue to be attracted by state-to-state deals because that's just the way it works. But on the other hand, it's still being handled by the state corporations. They're under a big efficiency drive as well. The view at the top in China is that those guys spent a lot of money. It was pretty ineffective, very low rate of return. We're looking for more efficiency in the investment. And that same mantra is repeated over and over again, whether you're the board of directors at Chevron or ExxonMobil or Total or whatever. So it's that same drive. that's happening as well. And let's don't overemphasize the fact that there's this loud sucking sound going to China. Yes, it's gas, but we're still going to have 3/4 of Kazakh oil that's still going to be going the other direction. So it's not like it's a huge sea change or anything like that. It's going to be a little bit more gradual, except in the case of Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan is now really in the hands of the Chinese in a way that they were never in the hands of the Russians beforehand. So that's kind of the exception. But this is kind of where you are. If you're at the top of the world's gas pipe and there's gas everywhere, a friend in need is a friend indeed. So there you go.
Thank you. What I'd like to do now is to take questions. We'll take 2 questions and then let the panel have at those 2 and then move on to the next 2. So thank you. I see someone bravely volunteering to be the first question.
Hi, my name is MJ Crawford, and I'm a graduate student here. I had a question related to currency dynamics for the region. In a country like Kazakhstan with multi-vector economic relations, what is the predominant currency used for some of these transactions with the different countries, including Turkey, for example? And I guess what currency, I guess, is the most liquid for these transactions? And do you think that there's any possibility of China trying to use the renminbi as a vehicle currency, not just in the region, but even broader? Thanks.
Okay.
I'll answer this on the energy side. Remember that 80% of Kazakh exports, oil and energy, that's all denominated in dollars. Therefore, when they trade in China, it's bucks. The only place where they're talking about using the yuan is what's happening between Russia and China, because the U.S. is the big hegemon in terms of the world economy. But for Kazakhstan, it's about dollars. In terms of their trade, it's just how it is. If you're in the energy sphere, not much is going to change, regardless of whether you sell it to China or whether you sell it to the EU or heaven forbid the United States, which is probably not going to happen now. We're the one country that doesn't need any more oil, but it's basically going to be the buck. And the way that the Kazakh currency works, it's very much like a petrostate, which is what they are. Price of the oil basically determines the underlying liquidity, and there you go. The only other thing that really puts the pressure on is really the trade relationship that they have with Russia and the fact that they've got to sort of match what's happening with the tenge.
Yeah, within the Eurasian Economic Union, it's mostly rubles, which under the circumstances even moved President Lukashenko of Belarus to demand sort of a switching to dollar. Inside Kazakhstan, we have, with all these developments we've been talking about, we've seen a tremendous shift to dollar deposits in the banks. 55% of bank deposits are in dollars, euros, and the January number is even sort of a more staggering. 93% of bank deposits made in January were in dollars. Not to mention the fact that last year, Kilimbetov, the governor of the National Bank, mentioned that half of cash that people, or rather money that people have, are under the mattress, and they're not in tenge either.
Jean, you had a question.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Hierman. Isn't the large percentage of rural population in all of these countries also a source of stability in effect? Because, as many of the state institutions and redistribution mechanisms in these societies have atrophied with the departure of Russia from the scene, the Soviet Union from the scene, being close to the land is a source of survival, and in an emergency can provide the ability to live off the fat of the land in many of these societies. Is that a fair thing to say? So there's not been a major kind of industrialization push. That's happening in Russia. That siphons off the population from these villages. But other than that, it's staying put. That's probably a more stable option. No?
I think that's fair, but with a caveat. The Tajik civil war broke out largely in the rural areas, and there's been cases of social tension over land in Kyrgyzstan. So it can be a stabilizing factor. However, when the quality of land in many of these areas is degrading, the access to the water that existed there in the late 1980s, in some cases has been eliminated or severely reduced because the irrigation pumps have broken or filled up with silt, and there's no funding there to pay for it. Since you had a lot of land that was reclaimed desert, and again, I'm talking about Tajikistan, but not exclusively. Without the investment, even that sustenance that the land should provide, it can be pushed to its breaking points. And so if we are to see the remittances start to dry up, or people return from Russia to the land, to the rural areas, I'm not sure how much in some districts in particular, how much they can absorb of that population.
Next question. Yes, please.
My name is Bakhtiyor Safarov. I'm from Central Asia Consulting. My question to Professor Brent. The question regarding the tension with the land situation between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. So, you know, there was in 2014 and 2013, and throughout the whole many years of independence, there is one enclave for Tajikistan in the territory of Kyrgyzstan. So, do you think that it's going to be a potential conflict for future, or what's going to be your analysis and prediction on this? Thank you.
It's an important issue in the Fergana Valley area, where there's competing definitions of the border, essentially, and it has to do with the quality of land and land scarcity. I don't envision it turning into a large-scale interstate conflict. I think we're likely to see continuations of what we've been seeing, mobilizations on either side, and small-scale conflicts in that area. But I haven't done much individual research there. I haven't talked to those actors who it's specifically involving. So this is just really from outside looking at it, and my read of the situation.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Janet Killian. I'm from the State Department, and I have a question for, Professor Hierman, about the collective farms, and if maybe the differences in where privatization of land took place had anything to do with how they were formed in the first place. You know, so some areas were already settled, other places were newly developed, as you'd mentioned, with like maybe transplants from Badakhshan or something. And it's not necessarily, it could be ethnic, but it could also just be regional differences in that way. And then the second question is really about the role of debt, and is how that is or not an impediment towards future reform of privatization in general.
Yeah, good. Thank you for those questions. In terms of the past history mattering, my analysis is focused on cotton farms and cotton producing districts by and in large part to keep that as constant as possible. Because even in those areas where there has been farming for a number of years, which were later turned into cotton farms, there's been enough change in the nature of those farms. There is tremendous variation across the various districts if you broaden it beyond cotton producing districts. Gabao decollectivized really easily and really fast, in part because the land is not particularly valuable, and no one was fighting to hold on to it. And versus, if you have productive cotton districts that are well irrigated, even naturally irrigated, then it's a lot. There's more incentive to hold on to it. So I haven't looked too much at the historical dynamics, in large part because as a political scientist, I'm trying to control for as much as I can, and it's really hard in Tajikistan to do that. But it's a good question and something I should probably try to dig into a little more, especially given the fact that the tensions that helped to initiate the Civil War were regional dynamics and had to do with these long-standing grievances. But in many interviews, it hasn't come up too much when I'm on the ground talking to people saying that, this was totally changed. But that could also be a product of how I'm asking the questions. As far as debt goes, debt's a problem. It's been a problem from the beginning. I did ask a question in my most recent survey about did the level of debt contribute to whether or not you tried to withdraw a land share. And there was a high percentage, I don't have the numbers with me, but a high percentage said yes, it did. And we're not talking about, in many cases, we're not talking about a huge amount of monetary debt, but it's relative to Tajikistan, and if you don't have any liquid assets to spend on the debt, it is an impediment. And it's an impediment in cases, because we've also seen the feminization of agriculture in Tajikistan. Men are working in Russia or other places. And so in many cases, women are getting land, whether or not they want it, right, as the collective farms break up, and then we'll have to figure out how to pay the debt, and sometimes from remittances, that's where the money initially goes, which means that you're not spending that money on other things you need to run the farm, like seeds or fertilizers or or anything to offset a bad harvest. So debt is a big problem, despite all the reforms that have, been trying to isolate that and saying, wipe out farm debt, but the debt keeps coming back. And credit is also a huge problem.
Yes.
Farukh Nazarov, Central Asian Fellow at Georgetown, Washington University. I have a question. My first question goes to Sergei, and Kazakhstan has made an interesting switch, actually transforming itself from a funds borrowing country to a fund provider by establishing Kaz8. So I wonder how actually the crisis in Russia affected that, and taking into account that actually the prices plummeted, oil prices, does it really affect this kind of long-lasting strategy with regard to Kaz8? And my second question goes to the star of the show, to Brent. Actually, when I looked at your analysis perception of how much they are pleased or happy with particular infrastructure points as well, public goods you mentioned, right? So I wonder, did you take the service yourself? Because I think that when foreigners show up in Central Asia and asking questions, they do bias actually respondents, and especially I saw that police, they were not as good, for example, scoring as electricity, but at the same time, to me it was surprising that police scored that high. Yes. Because usually people in Central Asia, they are absolutely not happy with police itself. Yeah. So that's why to me it was surprising to see it even there. Yes. So if you could explain and elaborate that methodologically on that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
To the best of my knowledge, Kaz8 is still work in the progress. And what happened since even 2008 and 2009 and has not reversed yet is the withdrawal of Kazakhstani businesses from other Central Asian states, particularly Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where they dominated, let us say, the banking sector. So it's sort of a premature to sort of argue that that institution is affecting economic development in any positive way in other Central Asian states. Also, it's also important to bear in mind that there is an low simmering, emerging, you name it, conflict between Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan as far as it relates to water. You know, this is the #1 priority for economic development for those two countries. And Kazakhstan has unequivocally sided itself with Uzbekistan on the issue. As you know, President Karimov and Nazarbayev have been holding regular summits, and this is their sort of a joint position on the issue, which sort of I guess would further complicate any aid or investment projects for Kazakhstan in specifically those two countries.
Great, thank you, Farouk. So you don't think that there's that high degree of satisfaction in police in Central Asia? No, in part. So I did not conduct the survey myself. I had a local research assistant do it, but in part there may be systematic bias across all the goods, the satisfaction of goods. In regard to the police, I have a second question where I asked. If there's a crime, a small crime, do you call the police? Would you, And the vast majority would say no. We'd solve it ourselves, right? And I've done other surveys in Central Asia, and I found in the rural areas, and in some of my own interviews when I talk about the police, in rural areas there isn't the same degree of distrust of the police as I found in urban areas, where people will openly criticize and complain about being targeted by police, in part because there isn't contact in many cases with the police to the same degree as they have in the urban areas. Obviously, they do when they're traveling places. They get stopped by the traffic cops and have to pay money. But so in part, I think that data is telling me that there's a lack of contact, and if I combine it with the question about solving or any crimes at the local area where people don't rely on the police and know that if they call the police they have to pay for the gas and they have to feed them and so there's a reluctance to involve the police and so there's a lack of contact, but also perhaps this question is getting at general feelings of security, and it goes beyond specifically the police.
The back?
Sophia Srinivasan, student in the School of Foreign Service here. My question is for Dr. Sagers. With regard to the Turkmen oil sector, you spoke about how development is coming mostly from foreign companies instead of state companies, and I was wondering if you could explain that further. Why is that happening, and do you see any differences between the foreign involvement in the oil sector and the gas sector? Thank you.
The gas sector is far more political. It's great big fields, and it's always been the purview of the Turkmen Gas, the big state corporation. On the other hand, they've always let in the smaller guys to come in and develop smaller fields, Dragon, Burin, Maitro, and so forth. And those guys have been relatively successful. They've been working under the radar. They've spent some bucks and expanded production. And last year it appears that there was more oil produced by the independents or the international companies than there was by the state company for the first time. But at the same time, there has been some nasty bumps along the way. Eni, the large Italian company, bought Burin because of some other assets in other parts of the world. And president of Turkmenistan was really upset. He goes, wait, you didn't come and talk to me first? You bought something in my country and you didn't come? Yeah, we didn't even realize we even had any assets in Turkmenistan until after we were looking through. That's not what we about. And if you remember, they were on the skids for about a year. They couldn't get visas. Nobody came. You know, finally the president of ENI had to come and, you know, give the right kind of gifts and so forth and go on. And now they're kind of back on terms. But the degree of development has been just totally different. This has been small mom and pop stuff in Turkmenistan. On the other hand, the stuff in Kazakhstan is, you know, great big conglomerates and corporations. One has been investments that's been in the tens of millions of dollars, and the other one has been in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Greatly different in terms of scale.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Poonam Yanabi, and I'm with State Department. My question in regards to the remittances and as the migrant workers come back. As the remittances decrease and the migrant workers come back and China has an increased presence, do you foresee any sort of public backlash or civil unrest? And to what extent? For example, there were a few instances in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan where there was assaults against Chinese workers in these countries. Do you see that expanding and causing any sort of uprising within these countries, within the Central Asian states?
Why don't you talk about, because there has been some incidents already in some of the other non-energy sectors so far. Chinese money is welcome, not here, has been sort of and then I'll talk about energy.
Sure. It's something to keep an eye on. There's, I would say, deep world distrust of the Chinese presence. Despite this, a large number of farmland in Hatlan was given over to Han Chinese a few years back. So it's certainly an area that is potentially concerning. Could it expand? It could. I'm not comfortable making specific predictions about it, but there's world distrust. There's potential grievances. It could turn into something.
Yeah. On the energy side, in Kazakhstan, this has been something that's, again, very, very closely watched by the state. How many visas do we give? How many workers do you have? How many people are working on the different construction sites, whether it's pipelines or sort of whatever? And there is a general distrust that exists where the amount of money coming in from China has got to be watched within certain kind of limits, the number of people coming in, working on the project and so forth, and we've got to maintain a very diversified investment profile. That's part of it. The one place where we could have sort of a backlash is what's happened in Turkmenistan, where basically the Turkmen population is relatively small. The Chinese have basically come in a very, very big way. I sort of ran through the list. It's been everything. And there could be a backlash in terms of the future, particularly if China tries to become more efficient or effective. And the largesse and the willingness on, let's say, for example, the border price changes with the oil price and these sorts of things. There could be sort of pressure and backlash and so forth that could happen very easily. Because they're involved in everything. They're doing upstream services. They've got the only PSA that exists in terms of the gas upstream, lots and lots of the money, investment funds and so forth. And it's not just on the energy side, but in a variety of kind of the other supporting services that go along with that.
On the remittances side, so far the figures that have been sort of popping up is the decline in 14% in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and the Labor Ministry of Tajikistan announced that in their estimate less than half of seasonal workers returned to Russia, those who sort of travel in and out. But that's just the official migrants who have been registered through the ministry. which again also may create a potential problem, social and whatnot, for President Rahmon.
I think we can take one last question, please.
Another question in regard to potential land conflict. This is also good to remember that the 2012 conflict that actually was in Badakhshan, the setup for all this conflict was the land that was, given to some part of Badakhshan province was given to China. So this is rather the comment in the future, any research to take these issues also into consideration. Thank you.
Angela, do we have a few more minutes, or are we set for a break? Oh, great, okay. Other questions? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Nick Wondra. I'm from the U.S. Department of Energy. My question is linked to Turkmenistan. You mentioned that China is increasingly becoming a hegemon in energy markets, and that Turkmenistan is increasingly beholden to China. Because of this, do you see Turkmenistan changing that policy in the next few years and increasingly engaging with the Russian Federation again?
At the moment, I don't see it changing because there's just simply no other choice. Russia, for example, the official policy is this year the amount of gas we've got coming north, we want to cut it in half. We're sitting on top of a sea of gas ourselves, so therefore, why are we buying it from Central Asia? And the only game in town you got is basically China. So they're looking to move the other projects forward, TAPI going into South Asia, or Trans-Caucasus and Trans-Caspian to go across the other way. But there's just no traction there. So there's really no other game in town. So the only other way that they can do this would be some kind of limit, shakedown, to try and to change the trajectory or speed by either negotiating more stuff from China or basically saying, you've kind of hit the limit here. But that's about the only choice they've got.
Actually, I want to jump in on this one, and that is that whether it's a realistic strategy or not is a point of debate, but Turkmenistan's actual approach in this has been to try to go very aggressively for the export of electricity. They've bought a series of turnkey power plants that they're siting on the border, and the intention is to sell electricity internationally because there's a more diversity of routes and because they think there is unmet demand in their own region. Whether it's viable or not remains open, but that is currently the strategy that's receiving priority with the Turkmen government.
By the same token, they're also looking at other esoteric options of monetizing the gas. GTL, methanol, different kinds of petchems and so forth, I don't know whether I would call them investors. Basically, they're more in the range of contractors. But these are Turkish companies, Chinese companies, and a couple of Japanese, or another one that's big there, big time, Korean as well. And it's all part of this thing of what else can we do to monetize this gas, electricity, and these other sort of more esoteric items.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
My question is to Brent Hierman from the Voice of America. How do you assess the impact of, let's say, World Bank, Asian Development Bank projects that have actually heavily focused on rural economic development, especially in agriculture? I mean, last year, close to like $500 million, being given as a loan to Uzbekistan. I know it's a big question, but just quickly.
The reforms have passed, and there's laws coming out of the center, which do have ramifications on the ground. And whether it's decollectivization or more recently in Tajikistan, things like the Freedom to Farm Act, which grants formally individual private farmers the ability to grow whatever they want. Of course, that sounds great, and supposedly they're going to diversify the crop outputs, and to some degree that's occurred. but there's formal and informal barriers that remain massive. Informal barriers such as you have lack of markets, whereas you know where the cotton gin is, and you know how to get to the cotton gin. If you're growing tomatoes, you have to figure out how you're going to sell them tomatoes, where you're going to sell them, are there processing plants? Lack of credit in many cases is a huge issue, and then of course you have pressures from local administrators telling farmers, despite this official law, that they have to grow cotton, or 60% of their land has to be cotton, and so to some level, despite the well-intentioned plans of these programs, the implementation on the ground is prey to local politics in many cases.
Yes, ma'am.
The moderator brought up electricity, and I was wondering, what is the current status of the two-tap project to export electricity from Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan into Afghanistan and Pakistan? Thank you.
CASA 1000. Still remains a gleam in everybody's eye. And the issue is exactly the one that you talked about, upstream and downstream. It's the difference between Utah and Colorado and Arizona and California. Downstream people hate it with a passion because the water's going to be blocked up top and it's going to flow at the wrong time when they need it for agriculture. Upstream folks don't see any benefits in terms of the agriculture in those big, deep basins. And so they basically, let's fill them up with water and generate it. And at the moment, the only real funders or interlocutors that have really stepped forward has been the development agencies, the development banks and so forth. And given this kind of a political and social structure that they're basically pushing against, no World Bank guy is going to want to buy into this.
In rural areas in Tajikistan, they have electricity for 4 hours a day. Yeah. You may remember that in 2010, the hike on the price of electricity in Kyrgyzstan was as a spark for the deposition of Bakiev. So what electricity can they export even today?
I would actually add that there's a little bit of potential fratricide among the projects, because the CASA 1000 supplies from one side. It is not designed to make allowances for supply from the other side. So Afghanistan, which has very limited capacity to build this infrastructure, is actually choosing when and how to pay attention to which project. But there are two major projects going on at once. One that flows largely out of Turkmenistan and is European development, and CASA 1000, which flows out of Tajikistan and is U.S.-sponsored development. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, where there's a very limited number of people who can pursue these projects and develop them, there's a lot of confusion about how to play that. Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the panelists for some great insights into a complex set of issues.